Good morning, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us for this first ever 100% online Government Analytics Breakfast Forum. I'm Jennifer Bachner, and I direct the Government Analytics program at Johns Hopkins University, which starting in fall 2020 actually will be renamed the Data Analytics and Policy Program. We host this Government Analytics Breakfast Forum with REI Systems to bring together academics and professionals to cultivate a community in which we discuss how analytics can be used to address challenges in the public sector. We've hosted this forum for about 5 years now and have heard from many top leaders in government about how they're meeting their missions using analytics. We very much encourage you to ask questions during this forum, as we like these events to be a conversation. We also encourage you to tweet about the forum using hashtag GAB forum, and we'll be posting a shareable video of the event afterward that you are welcome to share with your colleagues or review. Again, many thanks for joining us this morning, and at this point I will turn the program over to my co-host Jeff Myers at REI Systems.
Thanks, Jen. We really enjoy hosting these events. This community brings people together who frankly spark ideas in each other, and they help each other solve problems and serve as sounding boards. It's always easier in person, of course, but it's still possible virtually, although we can't serve you coffee and breakfast. I can, however, at the end of the event, if you would like, help put you in contact with the panelists. So if you are interested in that, you can either email me, jmyers@reisystems.com, or my colleague, Ashley Keaton, who sent the invitations out for this event. And as I'm sure it doesn't need to be said, this is really an unusual time, but it's actually kind of unusual in an interesting way that's relevant to this event. Frankly, people across America are discussing and disagreeing on the government's use of data and its implementation in policy. Of course, these are COVID infection trends and death rates, unfortunately, but it's analysis, and it's actually brought government analytics to the forefront of general popular conversation in America in a way that really hasn't happened often before in my experience. In fact, lives depend upon this, of course, and people care about it, even though they may bring very different values and preferences. I think that we can look forward to data and government policy making changes in some of those preferences, whether they be preferences about public health, expectations and perceptions about the anti-vaccination movement, emergency preparedness, all the way to things like, is remote work easy to do, and will it work in general? What sorts of things should we be doing to prepare for climate change? What about remote voting, or whom I vote for? At REI Systems, we like the interest in data, frankly, because it's a big part of what we do. We help the government use technology to make lives better. Our case management system, for example, for the administration of children and families, has helped victims of human trafficking get services twice as fast as they previously had, and it's even begun to help predict and even prevent, in some instances, of human trafficking. And similarly, and actually more on point with the COVID crisis, our grants management expertise and software has helped the Health Resources and Services Administration, which is part of HHS, get emergency funding to more than 1,000 frontline health clinics faster than any other part of HHS. So we're proud of our contributions to government. But let's turn to today. The title of the program today is How Data and Evidence Can Improve Results from Government. And frankly, we started planning this session well before the events of the pandemic start to take shape. We actually in March began having in the last event with Johns Hopkins, the Government Analytics Breakfast Forum, we had policy experts and evaluators from OMB and labor who were discussing the purposes of the Evidence Act and its use and evaluation. Today, we have program managers, leaders, and legislative staff who are responsible for implementing the Evidence Act and making use of data to be able to improve government operations. We didn't think really that this would focus on the pandemic to start with, because as I say, we started planning it before the pandemic, but I'm sure that some of the comments from the panelists will touch on the pandemic, and some of your questions may as well. I want to give particular recognition because much of this discussion was organized by a student at Johns Hopkins Government Analytics Program, and he is dedicating his career to government performance, Jed Herman. Jed's a vice president at the nonprofit Results for America, and is focused currently on state, local, and federal government's use of data to get results. Previously, though, Jed has served within government at the Corporation for National and Community Service, in the New York City's Consumer Affairs Department, as a teacher, also as a Peace Corps volunteer, and in political campaigns. Interestingly, we have folks who have participated on both sides of the political aisle who will be speaking today. So let's get started. While Jed is getting set, let me mention to you that we do encourage you as the audience to ask questions. We may encourage occasionally the members of the panel to ask questions of you. We will take questions in two ways. So at any time, starting right now, you can type your questions into the question box that's immediately below the audio controls for this GoToWebinar. But as well, after the keynote speech by Sean Cairncross, as well as after the panel discussion, if you click on the little hand icon that's currently likely green, it will turn red. That's raising your hand. And Jed, as the facilitator, will call on you and will unmute you, and you can ask your question in real time orally. Please remember, though, that this session is being recorded. It'll be available on both the Johns Hopkins and REI website within 48 hours after the event. So don't ask the sort of question you wouldn't want someone to accidentally send to your mother as an audio clip later. With that, let me turn it over to Jed. Thanks so much, Jed, for being here and for organizing this event. We're really looking forward to it.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for having me here this morning. And this is going to be a great panel. You know, at Results for America, where I work on state and federal policy, we really focus on how government at all levels can use data and evidence as tools to get better results. And so I think we're now speaking to our core audience, and we have our all-star group of panelists and presenters this morning that are going to really talk about that. And Jeff gave some great examples of how that can really happen in the real world. And so it's my pleasure this morning to introduce Sean Cairncross, who's the CEO of the Millennium Challenge Corporation. In a minute, he'll share some remarks with you, and then we'll have a short question and answer period where I'll call on people to ask them some questions. But I want to say that I can't think of anyone better to talk about our topic today. Under his leadership, the Millennium Challenge Corporation is employing data and evidence as powerful tools to improve the lives of people around the world. In fact, in an annual policy report that we release at Results for America on how federal agencies use evidence and data, MCC scored on the top of all agencies last year. But they're not resting on their laurels, and the agency continues to innovate on how to employ data and evidence as tools to get better results. So it's my great pleasure today to kick off our Government Analytics Breakfast to introduce one of the federal government's leader on evidence-based policy, Sean Cairncross, CEO of the Millennium Challenge Corporation. Sean?
Thanks, Jed. I appreciate it. Thanks everyone for jumping online, and thank you to Jen and Jeff as well. I'm Sean Cairncross. I'm the Chief Executive Officer of the Millennium Challenge Corporation, and I want to start by saying thanks to Results for America and Johns Hopkins for hosting the forum, especially given the challenging circumstances under the pandemic. And I hope all of you are staying safe and healthy. I want to start by giving everyone just a quick MCC 101. MCC is a development agency, that's right, but we're different. We were created in 2004 under the Bush administration with the idea that development could be done more effectively. That by taking a hard, focused, data-driven approach, the application of U.S. foreign assistance could achieve better results. So in 2004, that turned into bipartisan legislation, which created this agency, and MCC still enjoys that bipartisan support today. It has a single focus. We're here to reduce poverty through economic growth. Not reduce poverty and create economic growth. We are reducing poverty through economic growth. And we do this by helping our partner countries generate sustainable, market-driven economies that consolidate democratic reforms and allow them to lift their people out of poverty. So where, how, and who we work with is all determined by data. We only work with poor, but relatively well-governed countries. So in other words, our partners must be lower or lower middle income countries, and they've got to demonstrate solid, strong commitment to investing in their people, economic reform, and ruling justly. We also are here to make sure that they're governed and actively working to fight and prevent corruption. But MCC doesn't make these determinations or select its partner countries unilaterally. Data drives all of these decisions by collecting information from open source third-party institutions to determine everything from a country's income level to its policy performance. We compile all this data based on objective criteria, and we build country scorecards, and they're all available online on our website, mcc.gov, every year to determine an eligible candidate pool for our support. Our board of directors then considers and selects partner countries. So for example, in 2019, the board selected Mozambique for a 5-year compact and Kenya for a threshold program. So after selection, MCC uses rigorous analysis to design its investments. We look at the biggest factors holding back a country's economy, and then we partner with the governments to design a program to unlock the most pressing constraints on their economic growth. Our country selection process constraints analysis are just 2 of the factors that make MCC's development model so unique. Our competitive, data-driven country selection process incentivizes potential and existing partner countries to implement critical reforms with the specific goal of improving on MCC's eligibility criteria. And we've seen this time and again in cases that even before MCC has spent $1, improvement is happening. In Cote d'Ivoire, for example, when President Ouattara was elected, Cote d'Ivoire passed only 5 of 20 indicators on our scorecard. But he made this a point of his administration, and after passing 11 of 20, Cote d'Ivoire was selected in 2013 for a compact and passed 14 indicators today. This has happened. We refer to this as the MCC effect, and we're proud of it. Our country selection process has been highly successful in leveraging important change in many countries around the world. In everything we do, we emphasize data, evaluation, and transparency. In other words, the hard stuff. The story of MCC is really centered around the principles of accountability and delivering results, proving that we can go beyond just words to get the most value for US taxpayer dollars. And it's not just me saying this. MCC has been ranked as the top US government agency in Results for America's Invest in What Works federal standard of excellence for the past 4 years. So we have a dedicated and mission-driven team at MCC. And thanks again to Results for America for acknowledging the hard work of this agency. Okay, now let me address the elephant in the room, or in the virtual room, the MCC model holding up in times of uncertainty like now. MCC's country-led programs are structured to build capacity and invest in long-term sustainable economic growth. The type of development, using COVID as an example, that generates the necessary conditions to allow and promote economic revitalization and job creation once the pandemic subsides. By design, MCC doesn't target immediate relief in our effort with partner countries. But many of our projects with partner countries do directly strengthen a country's health system or focus on other interventions that indirectly improve the country's health outcomes. In some countries, Lesotho, for example, the overall health of the population was identified as a binding constraint to the country's economic growth. So MCC's programs directly targeted improvements in the country's health systems through activities like the construction or rehabilitation of healthcare centers. In other MCC partner countries, health-related binding constraints were identified as a lack of power, transport, or water, sanitation, and hygiene. So in these cases, MCC's work in these sectors has an indirect impact on the delivery of healthcare services. In Ghana, for example, MCC's project connects hospitals and clinics to reliable power sources, a critical factor in improving health systems. As you can imagine, unreliable electricity can spoil vaccine inventories, interrupt the use of medical and diagnostic devices, and inhibit proper performance of medical procedures due to poor lighting conditions. Our transport projects give vulnerable households easier access to health facilities, which can improve health outcomes and save lives. One final example, MCC's programs in Zambia and Sierra Leone were designed to prevent disease and enhance overall sanitation by improving access to clean water sources and proper hygiene practices, which of course helps lead to a healthy population. All that's to say, the pandemic doesn't change our mission or approach to development. In fact, in many ways, it reinforces it. MCC's programs are designed to create sustainable economic growth and build country capacity. so that our partners are better able to withstand and recover from the impacts of major events like the current pandemic. Our programs are often designed to serve as a roadmap for to a stronger economy for our partner countries. And this includes during times of economic recovery, as we hope to see in the coming months. So let me just finish by saying that it's important for me that MCC remains focused on our strengths and what we hold true to our model of effective economic development. And as far as I know, the only way to do that is through accountability. And this means we've got to continue to hold our partner countries and their commitments and hold ourselves accountable to the American taxpayer. That means continuing to stay true to our mission and our model and making decisions based on data and hard evidence every step of the way. So thank you. I'm looking forward to taking your questions. And Jed, I will kick it back over to you.
Great. Thanks, Mr. Cairncross. We really appreciate those remarks and the good examples of impact that MCC is having across the world to improve people's lives and the important role that data and evidence are playing in that. So it's been a pleasure working with you and your agency over the past many years and your participation in the Federal Standard of Excellence, and really setting an example for what other agencies can be doing to make data and evidence central to the work they do. So thank you. And with that, we'll take some questions for the audience. As Jeff said, we can take that in two forms. One, you can use the ask question box, or two, you can raise your hand and we'll call on you to be unmuted. Let's see, let me just give a second for some questions to come in here. Let's see, we've got a first question here. MCC is often referred to as a data-driven agency. Can you give an example of what that looks like in practice?
Sure. For example, I think it works in a couple of different ways. The first is, like I say, with our selection and eligibility criteria. So part of what drives MCC is determining who we work with on an objective basis. So we look at good governance, economic reform, and a government's responsiveness to its own people. And the model of the agency was to set objective criteria for that selection. So we don't do it ourselves. We use third-party data, Freedom House, Heritage Foundation, the World Bank. And we take that amalgamated data and turn it into scorecards and then make our selections based on those criteria. Then once we enter into a project, we rely on data to drive where that project goes. So we conduct with our partner countries something called the constraints analysis. That goes about identifying the core constraints on a country's economy. And once there's an agreement on what those constraints are, we move to the project development phase. And we go through that development. What we're looking for is an achievable, concrete project that's measurable, that'll be sustainable, and that can have a direct impact on helping with the constraints on that economy. And once we identify that, we enter into force, and that starts a 5-year clock on our programs. And that's an important distinction with other agencies. Well, I referred to in my remarks a compact and a threshold program. So a compact is generally $350 to $800 million of grant money designed for these programs. And those are for countries that meet that data and that eligibility and selection criteria. And a threshold program is available to countries that don't quite get there on the governing standards, but are making progress in the right direction. And that's generally a $30 to $50 million program over a couple of years.
Great, thank you. It's a very good explanation. In fact, let me pick up on that from our next question that we have here, which is, there are numerous international development agencies. Can you talk a little about MCC's role and model and how that may be different from others like USAID or OPIC or other organizations that are working internationally?
Sure. Well, the first thing I'd say is we are different. We occupy a unique niche, but we work the work that we do with our interagency partners is vital, and it all reinforces each other. And let me just start with the big picture there. I see things as sort of on an arc of development where USAID is really focused on poverty alleviation, disaster relief, vaccinations, the sort of things that that are driven by real human need. And then we come after that, where we're looking at governance. We're looking at a government that is formed, that is trying to deliver basic goods and services to its people, and it's doing so in a way that's responsive to those people. It's democratically elected, and it's making progress on economic reform and that basic responsiveness. And we have a singular focus, reducing poverty through economic growth. So that is really what we're driving. And then on top of us, on that arc, sits the Development Finance Corporation, the DFC, for example. And the DFC is designed to bring in private investment and private capital into a country. And so what we're trying to work with is sort of that space between AID and DFC, creating the enabling environment that would attract that sort of capital and that sort of investment, the sort of thing that's needed to create jobs, sustain growth, to help the government deliver on its basic promise to its people. And really we're able to do that. I think part of, Jed, what makes this such a unique agency is with our grant funding and our time limits and our data-driven focus, we're able to really unlock institutional and policy reforms that are hard otherwise to reach, because governments want to work with us. We don't offer a debt-driven model, it's grant financed. And it carries with it the sort of the seal of approval of the United States government that this is a country that's moving in the right direction, that's trying to be responsive to its people. And so that in and of itself is, like I say, that incentivizing effect on the front end, and then all throughout the life cycle of our projects, trying to bring in more investment and create a more sustainable economy.
Great, that's a great answer, and very, very clear for people to understand, the audience, the unique role that MCC plays in the international development space. We've got another question here, and as a reminder, you can type questions in the question box or you can raise your hand. This question is from Andrew Feldman, and I forgot to read who the last one was from. I apologize for that. He asked, what's the role of agency leadership for creating a culture of data and evidence? I think we've really seen that at MCC, so it'd be great to hear about that.
Yeah, my job is to make sure I'm helping tell the world and groups like this about the work that the agency is doing. Hopefully there are some students online who are seeing this, who are thinking about future job opportunities here. But what we really do is rely on our staff. We have a wonderful staff of experts. These are individuals who are mission driven. They are here because they love the model. Many are from the private sector. They've been involved in transportation or infrastructure or something like that. Many are from our interagency partners, AID or the State Department, but they're here for that reason and driving those projects forward where there's a real measurable result. This isn't a program where where the impact of the program isn't felt directly. You can go to an MCC partner country. There is the project that we've been working on. Here are the measures that have been put into place for that project to be sustainable. Here are the policy reforms that have been achieved. And on top of that, as Results for America is so great at highlighting, all of this is available and transparent for anyone to go see. Our scorecards are open and public. Our projects are public. We publish what are called star reports after our projects are finished that evaluate them soup to nuts, the good and the bad. And we monitor and evaluate our projects for 20 years after that 5-year clock is over and our compact has closed. So our monitoring and evaluative process actually continues for longer than the agency has been in existence today. And it's something that's a great model, but it is really, it's the staff of the agency that drive it and make it a success.
That's great. I can certainly say from our experience, working with Tom Kelly on your team and Casey Dunning, are always trying to innovate and find new ways to get this information out to people. And that level of transparency you talked about, I think, is really important for people to be able to understand how you're making these assessments and what that means. And in fact, we have another question in that vein, which is, other countries may not make their data as accessible, and it may not be as clear, or sometimes it can be pretty messy, especially when international foreign countries are developing data. How do you deal with situations where that data is messy or may not be transparent, and how does that fit into your process at MCC?
Yeah, well, Jed, challenge is literally the middle name of the agency. So we work, each of our partner countries, we work to develop a strong relationship with the government, from the head of state all the way down through the relevant ministries. We work, when we go in country, we're not just working with the government. I think that's a really important point. We're working with civil society. So we're working with the stakeholder groups that will be affected and impacted by our projects. Farmers, the private sector, et cetera. And data comes from all of these different sources. But we work tirelessly to ensure that we have access to the relevant data in country. Our teams are around the world. There's an enormous amount of, until very recently, there was an enormous amount of travel that the agency undertook. And we expect to hopefully to get started doing that again. But that's just it's a relationship that's built country by country. And you're right. I was remiss failing to mention our acting vice president for policy and evaluation. Tom Kelly is, I think, on the panel later, and he's an excellent example of the sort of staff that makes this agency such a success.
Great, thanks. I think we have time for one last question, which is, the concept of learning agendas have been expanding in the federal government, including being part of the Evidence Act. Can you talk either specifically about how MCC is using learning agendas, or more generally, how MCC uses a sort of learning agenda approach to continually improve your work?
Yeah, we have it's a very growth mindset at the agency. I think it applies to everything from the large scale, our projects. We look, each of our projects, it's iterative. So we're always learning and trying to make the next one better. And Indonesia is a great example of that. We had a compact with Indonesia. Part of that compact, it was a green energy project, simply wasn't as successful as we originally thought. But that we were very open about that. We were very public about that. And we are now back in development in Indonesia on a second compact. And we've not only learned from that first compact in what didn't work so well, and it was a resounding success in many ways, but I'm talking about one specific part of that. But we've learned from that mistake, and we've also cycled that through our other projects. So that's on the sort of the large scale. But then just individually, we are constantly striving to improve, and that's at the agency, the interdepartmental conversations and meetings. It's a very group oriented, team-based agency, and so the teams draw from departments across the agency and are constantly working together. We have our two largest departments, compact operations and policy evaluation. You have the builders and the economists, and there's a great natural tension that exists there. And what I really love about this agency is, to the extent that there's any disagreement at the agency, it is purely about ideas. It is a great it is a great struggle for ideas every day on these projects, and people are testing one another and holding each other accountable for the results. And I think that sort of mindset and ethos that the agency carries into the work helps make these projects lasting and successful. And I think, in Washington, D.C., I think it's pretty rare for a concept to go from concept to reality at all, and then enjoy bipartisan support and success in a very short period of time. And MCC's managed to do that in its 15-year history. And like I say, that so much of that has to do with that mindset that you were talking about, and the people who are here executing.
Well, Sean, thanks for joining us today. It's a great opportunity for all of us in the data and evidence community, for Johns Hopkins University, for those folks that work at federal agencies. We've got a number of other agencies online today to hear from you and about how MCC is doing this work. Your leadership is really appreciated. It makes a big difference, I know, in countries around the world and here at home in the US, where countries can really, other agencies can really follow MCC's example and learn about the work that you're doing, be part of a larger learning community about how data and evidence are really affecting the federal government and getting better outcomes. So thanks so much for joining us here today.
Oh, it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you.
Great. And with that, Sean's going to exit the screen, and I'm going to ask our panelists to join us here on the screen for all of you. And while they're doing that, we're going to have just want to remind people that we're going to have a panel conversation here. I'll introduce our panelists in a second, and then we'll have some additional Q&A, and that people can follow the same Q&A ways they just did, to either raise their hand or asking questions in the chat box. With that, let me introduce our august panelists. It's an all-star group we have with us here today, especially if you want to learn about how the federal government is using data and evidence as tools to get better results. It'd be very difficult to assemble a more informed and knowledgeable group on this topic, and they represent a variety of viewpoints from across the landscape that really give us a well-rounded picture, from Congress and the legislative branch to cross-agency coordination to individual agencies, domestic agencies, international. So it really gives us a great context to have this conversation. Before I introduce them, I just want to add some brief context, and Jeff mentioned this up top. This is really an unprecedented time for our country. The COVID-19 pandemic represents a real challenge, and also puts in stark relief, as Jeff said, the role that evidence and data can play in government policy. So we'll take this opportunity to ask our panelists both about their specific work on coronavirus, as well as the broader perspective about how evidence-based policy can better equip governments and communities to respond to disasters of all kinds. Finally, I just want to mention, as Jeff noted up top, last month was a conversation on the Evidence Act at the Government Analytics Breakfast Forum. So just wanted some quick context that the Evidence Act passed last year and sets a new course for how federal agencies build evidence for decision-making, requires agencies to appoint relevant data and evaluation officials to coordinate their evidence activities, and also creates cross-government initiatives to spur the sharing of best practices. And so our panelists today both helped create this legislation and are also at the forefront of implementing it, both at agencies and in a cross-government perspective. So we're going to start with having our panelists just quickly introduce themselves. And so let's start with John Ryder, who's probably the person in the legislative branch who is the most knowledgeable about the role that evidence can play in improving policy. And before I introduce John, I'd just like to note that his remarks here are off the record. So John, can you tell us briefly about who you are and the work that you do?
Sure. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us. I hope that all those participating and watching, that you're safe and well and your families are safe and well. My name is John Ryder. I'm the Deputy Staff Director of the United States Senate Help Committee. I work for Senator Patty Murray from the great state of Washington. I hope to bring three sets of experiences and perspectives to the conversation today. One being, having 25 years working on Capitol Hill, mostly in the Senate. Second being in the area of evidence, being Senator Murray's lead staffer on two pieces of legislation that she partnered with former Speaker Paul Ryan. Those being first, creating the Commission on Evidence-Based Policymaking, which was a blue ribbon panel, 15 members who delivered a set of unanimous recommendations in the fall of 2017. And then secondly, as Jed mentioned, the Evidence Act that implemented half of those recommendations and it made progress on modernizing privacy and increasing secure access to data and building capacity. And then lastly, to distill a little bit that through this, this unprecedented situation we all find ourselves in, this policy-making challenge of our times, which is COVID-19 pandemic, and Senator Murray's experience as the lead on HELP, which oversees public health and public health agencies.
Great, thanks, John. We look forward to diving into that with you. I think you've got a lot to tell us today about how that work, both the history and how that work is being done today in the face of the COVID-19 pandemic. Next, I'd like to introduce Todd Richardson, whose work at HUD has been at the leading edge of how federal agencies use evaluation data to determine the effectiveness of federal programs. Under his leadership, HUD has been a long-time leader in robust evaluation infrastructure, and it's a real pleasure and honor to have him here today. Todd, you want to tell us briefly about your work at HUD?
Sure. Thanks, Jed. John, thanks for the Evidence Act. So I'm the senior career official in HUD's research office. We have about 150 professionals in our research office. And for purposes of discussing the Evidence Act, I'm the evaluation officer of HUD. We also have within PD&R the statistical officer and the acting chief data officer. So personally, I've been in the housing community development business for about 30 years. I've run programs, I've studied programs, and I've analyzed a lot of data. So I want to remember today is this week, Public Service Recognition Week. So I think I want to thank all of the public servants that are on the call today. So I appreciate your work. Special thanks to our public health professionals who have been on the front lines of the pandemic, risking their lives to save others. For HUD, we're working to implement programs so that the most economically fragile households, new homeowners, low-income renters, low-income communities, that those communities don't lose a rung on the economic ladder during this crisis. So that's what we're working on right now. Thanks for having me today. Look forward to the conversation.
Great, thanks, Todd. I'd like to introduce now Tom Kelly from Millennium Challenge Corporation. You heard earlier from MCC CEO Sean Carecross about MCC's cutting-edge use of data and evidence, and Tom has really been the driving force behind this, as Mr. Carecross mentioned, in recent years, and he continues really to push this forward. So, Tom, a pleasure to have you here today. Why don't you tell us a little about your role at MCC and the work that you do?
Thank you, and thank you for having us here this morning. Our CEO, Sean Carecross, mentioned during his keynote address that the reason MCC was founded as an institution was to try and do foreign assistance or economic development abroad better. And to do that, to take a technical-minded, evidence-based approach to do that. I manage a unit at MCC that has about 60 or 70 extremely dedicated staff who see that as their kind of mandate. For some of them, see it kind of as a vocation, actually. So in that unit, we have our economists, we have our monitoring and evaluation specialists, and a team of experts who works on governance indicators as well. And each of them has as their responsibility making sure that MCC pushes as hard as it can to make sure that everything it does is as evidence-based as possible. Thanks.
Thanks, Tom. Really appreciate your work and your leadership. I think it makes a big difference. Finally, I want to introduce Trey Bradley from the General Services Administration. Trey's been leading important efforts across the government to improve coordination and use of data and adds a great cross-agency perspective to our conversation today. Trey, you want to tell us a little about the work you're doing at GSA?
Sure. Thank you, Jed. So my name is Trey Bradley. My title is Program Manager, Strategic Data Initiatives at the Office for Shared Solutions and Performance Improvement at GSA. And in that capacity, I manage several large government, cross-government data assets and data analysis initiatives. A few years ago, OMB asked me to serve on the Federal Data Strategy project team, which has been a great honor. So when I speak today, I'm speaking from the perspective of the Federal Data Strategy, which is similar but distinct from the Evidence Act. And I'll just, because it is different, let me take a few minutes just to talk about, or a few seconds to talk about what that is. So the Federal Data Strategy is a cross-agency priority goal. So it's a cross-government initiative It's part of the president's management agenda. It's got several different elements. The most important one for today is the annual action plan. If you look at the annual action plan, you can see all this on our website, strategy.data.gov. You'll notice that there is a lot of overlap with the Evidence Act, and that is really by design. In many cases, what we're doing with the federal data strategy is we're reinforcing some key principles, actions in critical legislation like the Evidence Act or other executive orders, and also kind of filling in the white space too. So providing a community to share ideas and experience, providing support through playbooks, examples. And one of the key activities that we are supporting right now at GSA is the establishment of the CDO Council, which was laid out both in the Evidence Act and the Federal Data Strategy. And the CDO Council is up and running. The formalization of the CDO role, the establishment of the councils, I think is a great step forward and really was a long time coming. We've got 70 plus members. We're meeting on a regular basis. It's part of a larger ecosystem too, which is what the Evidence Act and the Federal Data Strategy envisioned, where the CDOs are working with evaluation officers, chief statistical officers, to really build up the infrastructure for data so that we can respond to things like COVID-19. And that has been a big focus, obviously, of the CDO Council's discussions lately. But we're also focused on the longer term, like focusing on the fundamentals again. And you can read about the different actions again on our website. I'm happy to answer more questions about that as we go along.
Great, thanks, Trey. That's really great context. Let's dive in now. And John, first question for you. So when you think about the COVID-19 pandemic, that's a huge national problem, and really action starts with Congress, as we've seen. So how has Congress responded to COVID-19, and more to our conversation today, what role have data and evaluation played in that legislation?
So thank you for that question, Jed. So the states, to start with the obvious, the Congress are not executors, they're legislators. There's 4 different tools that they bring to a problem like this, even as unprecedented as it is, and that's in advocating, resourcing, directing, and then overseeing, providing oversight. So in the case of advocating, what I've seen with Senator Murray is literally whether she's talking with state officials, every chance she gets with her colleagues, in her own press that she puts out, emphasizing the need for science, for evidence-based research, for listening to our public health officials, for making the best decisions, the best informed decisions possible. Resourcing is using the power of the purse to put the money and direct the resources where they're needed to deal with this unprecedented challenge. Directing is within that power of the purse, making sure that when that money is provided, that there's a plan for using it, that there is guardrails around it, that there is data that is coming back that we can use to make more decisions and to learn long term. And then that forms that 4th channel, which is really being able to do the oversight, which that's part of it, but it's also picking up the phone, it's talking to agency heads, it's writing letters, it's giving directions to IGs and GAO to do research, it's doing the committee oversight, both bipartisan and on our own, it's doing multi-committee work that's coordinated. It's just a lot of those different features. So let me give you one example of that that's concrete. We, I think it was about a week ago, did what we call here the 3.5 supplemental, which was originally just to pump some more money into the Paycheck Protection Program, but it evolved to include some other things. So Washington State was the first state to really be hit. It was the original epicenter of this outbreak in the US. Senator Murray spent a lot of time talking with officials in the state, and other public health officials, and really building up her understanding of testing and where we had challenges in terms of capacity and processing and supplies needed to have a full-blown testing program. She brought that back into doing a white paper that she was then able to, that was a very detailed proposal that she was able to get not only her caucus, but House Democrats around as well. That became legislation that she brought to the table when we were doing what, again, I'm calling 3.5. And as part of that, it had the resource. First of all, it was informed by public health. It had the resources, $25 billion. It had that direction where it required the administration to put out a strategic plan. It required states and localities to also have plans and goals of what their needs are that would feed up to the national level. It requires there to be a tracking at a demographic data level so that we can deal with this horrible, among the many horrible challenges here, the difference in disparities and inequities that we're finding, and to learn more and be smarter about it. And then again, that will also form a big part of one of our channels of oversight that we will be doing. That will be a multi-year process, as we deal again with this extraordinary policymaking challenge.
Great, thanks for that, John. Before we go to the next question, any of our other panelists want to add their thoughts to that? Great. Trey, John, you really talked about building the capacity of governments at all levels to do this, right? Both how is Congress doing that, and then pushing that out into the field so other governments can do that. And Trey, you mentioned at the outset really the federal data strategy, which in many ways is a capacity building tool, right? To help the federal government better improve its capacity to use data for decision making, both in times of crises and in normal operations. So can you tell us a little bit more about how that federal data strategy is helping the federal government build long-term capacity to use data for decision making, and what some of the effects of that might be on this or future crises down the road to have that capacity?
Sure. So the way that I, as a data person, view the federal data strategy is really it's the culmination of what do we know about the best practice in data and putting it into action. In fact, the federal data strategy is laid out with three different elements. It starts with principles, sort of high level, enduring, sort of a North Star for agencies in the federal government to aspire to, and then the practices, which are more oriented toward the 10-year time horizon that I talked about before, and there are 40 practices, and then finally the annual action plans, which tell agencies what they need to focus on in a particular year. For this first year, really the focus to a large extent is on the fundamentals. What are the fundamentals that agencies need to be focused on? Many agencies are actually doing a lot of these things already. And in fact, all agencies, I would say, have pockets of excellence where they're doing these things well already. And they deal with actions such as identifying critical data elements for key agency questions, setting up a diverse governance body within the agency, assessing the maturity of your data infrastructure, increasing data skills in the agencies for data practitioners and also for the business. Also pushing toward, continuing to push toward open data where it makes sense, which really kind of sets the stage for collaboration. And then the federal data strategy also has actions in this year's plan that are focused on that collaborative element across agencies. In fact, Action 8, which deals with supporting AI research and development, there's some very positive developments addressing the COVID-19 crisis right now. For example, there recently has been established through collaboration with the Executive Office of the President and several agencies and public-private partnership, a COVID-19 high-performance computing consortium. In addition, a COVID-19 open research data set. So things are happening. the federal data strategy is really helping to support both the agency's use of data internally, but also the collaboration across agencies.
Great, thanks so much, Trey. Tom, let's go to you and MCC. You know, Sean Carecross really talked about a lot of MCC's role in the international development space, and Trey's just brought up an important point, I think, but it's about the data on the one hand, but it's also about the culture of how people are using this, and things like the federal data strategy are important governance structures. They also encourage this creation of data and evidence as strategic tools that can permeate into organizations. And so I think we've really seen for pandemics like COVID-19, you know, that they're international phenomena. And Sean Carecross talked a little about how MCC is helping countries build their capacity to use data and evidence as tools to address these pressing concerns, whether pandemic, famine, or other issues. Can you talk, maybe expand on his answer a little bit, and then perhaps talk about the role of sort of a culture of data and evidence in doing that?
Sure. I could talk a little bit about some specific things that MCC has done in terms of investing in capacity building for data abroad. But I actually think, Jed, your question about the culture is actually a more interesting question. Sean, at the beginning of this panel, or sorry, during the keynote, talked about this idea of how to do foreign assistance better. We started out with 3 principles when we were thinking about that. One is selectivity, working with the right countries, and he talked about that a fair amount. The second one is having a results focus, which is really what we're here to talk about now. The third one he didn't mention, though, and I think is really important for this notion of developing a culture of data use, is country ownership. So one of the challenges that many bilateral aid agencies face is we have our own mandates coming from our own governments. We have our own priorities coming from our own political process and our own funding mechanisms. And those don't always sync perfectly with our country partners. And if our country partners are ever going to be successful in developing, they're going to have to own what they do, and they're going to have to feel like they are executing on their own priorities, and it's their own responsibility. So one of the things we have tried to do is bring together this idea of results focus and country ownership, and effectively force them, invite them, but really we're forcing them to come with us on a journey through data use in identifying what sector we're going to work in doing a cost benefit analysis on every project where they have to find the data, they're doing the initial analysis, in doing the detailed plans for the infrastructure with the engineers, using highly data intensive techniques into the monitoring and the evaluation. We're doing this jointly with them each step of the way over a multi-year process, and it's government to government. And it's really effectively a kind of learning by doing process that, frankly, most of our country counterparts have come to embrace. They love it because it separates what they do from politics, from having to play to certain constituencies, and it really sort of empowers the reformers within these countries. Now, we didn't start with this bright idea of helping to develop a culture of evidence-based policy making in our counterparts. We started with the idea that they have to own it for it to work, and we, as a federal agency in Washington, have to be responsible, so we are going to be data-based. Those two things have come together, and what it does is, in the short term, it helps us be responsible, accountable to the Hill, accountable to our stakeholders, and to get the best results. But what's more important and kind of exciting is it helps build a culture in these countries that will live after our intervention, and that can help them take these ideas and these techniques forward, because at the end of the day, they're going to have to do it for themselves. We can never provide enough assistance for them to turn the corner.
That's great, Tom. Really smart approach, and actually brings a great segue to Todd. You know, when you talk about sort of modeling in an agency what you want to see in the organizations that you're serving, I think HUD has been doing a great job of that. You mentioned you've got a staff over 100 that are dedicated to this work of evaluation and data and making sure we're knowing what's working and finding out what's working. And so, you know, you've been doing that for a long time. And I think this pandemic sort of creates a unique moment in some ways, because, you know, the long-term response will really be about assessing and addressing what the impact has been on communities and what help they need. So can you give us a sense over, you know, HUD's recent history on this, How can this be done effectively? How has HUD used evaluation as a tool to help communities recover from crises, whether national in scope or more local in scope?
Hey, thanks. I appreciate that question. So HUD, all the components of HUD, many of them were born out of crisis. So the FHA mortgage insurance, our public housing programs, they came out of the Great Depression. The Fair Housing Act was signed right after Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated. Our housing price voucher program, also born out of the civil rights era. So HUD's research also has its roots that go all the way back to 1934. We began the research offices as part of FHA in 1934. So our last national crisis, as folks will remember, a decade ago, was a housing crisis. Now that foreclosure crisis, we can go back and look we've done research on that, what caused that crisis, how we got to that point. But we also did a lot of research on the tools we used and tested to try to deal with the foreclosure issues. And out of that, for this crisis, we're able to use those tools. So banks are much better capitalized than they were before the last crisis. That will help. We know that from the last crisis, housing crisis, was that foreclosures were driven not by just unemployment, but a combination of unemployment and falling home values. So if we can stay on top of the home values, we'll be able to reduce some of the risk of foreclosure. And so as a result, you will have seen this, all of the FHFA, FHA, we all moved very quickly to allow forbearance policies to apply. So folks may be having trouble paying their mortgage right now. That's not going to lead to a foreclosure. We're putting those your costs on the back end of the loan. So those are examples of what we learned, how we're applying that now. So what are we doing for this crisis? There are many things, of course, that we're working on this crisis, but I want to focus on one in a particular area of research. Before this crisis happened, we had some major challenges with homelessness in several communities across the country. A lot of funding has been provided through the CARES Act, also through FEMA, to try to help address the problems associated with homelessness and the coronavirus. This is also an opportunity to study these interventions. For example, in Washington State, in Seattle, which has a serious homeless crisis, they responded very quickly to try to adopt new policies. How do we deal with this problem? Well, we're studying that. So that's a really important part of this. It also gives us an opportunity to say, we don't really know the perfect strategy for dealing with individuals that are homeless, but we have a lot of different strategies. And so we're going to do research to look and see how each one of those strategies performs, to see how that can inform policy into the future.
Great, thanks, Todd. That's really helpful perspective to understand both the long-term trajectory and some immediate examples of HUD's important work. I want to turn back to John for a question about the Evidence Act, which he helped write, and then ask each of our panelists if they're willing to jump in a little bit about how the Evidence Act is informing their work. So John, the Evidence Act was designed to build the evaluation capacity of agencies that will be useful for future crises, but it's in the midst of implementation now. So, and agencies are almost completely focused on their response work. So what do you think the impact of the Evidence Act will be, both long-term and short-term, at agencies? How does this pandemic relate to it? And do you think the impact of the pandemic is positive or negative on Evidence Act implementation?
Thanks for that question, Jed. Well, I'm heartened just from my colleagues on this panel and hearing what they're doing, because they're hitting on a lot of the messages that we certainly wanted to bring to bear through the Commission and the Evidence Act. Todd talking about capacity, talking about what the strategies of sort of a learning agenda that goes along is hugely important. All the work that Trey is doing, talking about transparency, making data more available, more accessible. Also, all the collaborations that's happening across agencies to learn and coordinate, hugely important. And then, Tom's exactly right on the culture and then the leadership that both him and Mr. Cairncross talked about as being hugely important to make this work. On your question about whether it's a good thing or a bad thing, certainly when Senator Murray and former Speaker Ryan were drafting and designing the Evidence Act, we never foresaw this exact moment we would be in. But in a lot of ways, it was meant to deal with exactly this type of moment and to have agencies to be ready to have the leadership in place to really emphasize that collaboration and have capacity and really emphasize really smart, data-driven, evidence-based decision-making. I mean, I sort of see like 3 huge channels here that at the Evidence Act, you're right now it's all hands on deck, but that if we're going to get through this, that we're going to need, and I'll be thankful that it's in place, and that is first and foremost understanding what happened here and how we can make sure it never happens again. Secondly, all the many downstream effects that are happening. Todd mentioned one in homelessness, but we're going to have them in work, where we work, how we communicate, like we are here today. The nature of jobs and work, education. The impact of online learning, nutrition, mental health. There are so many downstream effects that we're going to agencies through their evaluation offices, through their learning agendas, through the collaboration, we're gonna have to get really smart on, because this isn't, even when we're out of COVID-19, these problems will still be there. And in many cases, they can be opportunities. They're not always problems, but it's a new world. And then lastly, through the legislation, we've created some amazing and some pretty incredible programs. The Congress is often seen as not always being very nimble or fast. We've pumped, roughly $3 trillion or will be into the economy in a variety of different ways: direct income support to families, some housing, nutrition, a lot of relief to small businesses, helping the public health sector. Those will also need a lot of care in the implementation, but also an incredible opportunity to learn from those and to feed those into learning agendas and ask good questions with smart people like you have on this panel who can help then figure out where do we go from here. So I mean, I'm thankful that it was even though the timing might be tough, that the Evidence Act is there, that I think it really helps reorient and set us in a position to better take advantage of this unprecedented, in many cases tragic moment, but also an opportunity to learn from it and get smarter.
Great, that's great perspective, John. Any of our other panelists have thoughts to add about the Evidence Act and what the COVID-19 pandemic means for implementation or the long-term future of Evidence Act work? Jump in,
I'll let
Tom.
Go first, and I can jump in after Tom.
Great, go Tom.
Thanks, Todd. I just wanted to underscore how big a deal something like this is. It may not be that apparent to people who work outside of government and who have a different perspective on things. It may seem obvious that this would be helpful, but it is much more helpful than people would expect. MCC has a huge advantage. The first huge advantage we had is that when we were created, our authorizing statute actually includes language in there about things like using quantitative indicators to the extent possible. And that made a big difference in the early culture at MCC. If you think about government writ large, it's made up of a lot of small organizational or large organizational units, and each of those has their own culture as a bureaucracy. And every bureaucracy has its own sociology. There's actually a field in the sociology of bureaucracies. In very few of those places is the default mode to be evidence-based. Some it's true, but very few is it the default. So if you have an external impulse of some kind, or an external constraint, or an external empowering mechanism like authorizing legislation or like the Evidence Act, it really changes the conversation inside the organization. The other thing I would say is that in addition to using the power of the representatives of the taxpayer to help guide where the organization goes, it's really helpful how public all of this is, and I would say panels like this, because one of the things it forces us to do is get outside the organization to talk about what it is we're committed to in terms of transparency or evidence use or the other things the panelists have mentioned, and allow the public to hear about this and then hold us accountable to it, because that also really changes the dynamic internally. So I think that this kind of thing, like the Evidence Act, really changes in subtle ways the ways that many different bureaucracies function all across government.
That's great, really important perspective, Tom. Todd, you want to add to that?
Yeah, so research and data is really critical at times like this to be able to inform what we should be doing in responding to our program. So HUD's gotten some money through CARES Act. I've talked daily with my colleagues in each of the program offices about what research and data can inform where we're sending those dollars and how those dollars are being spent. One thing that I've noted for this crisis that's been particularly helpful is that we have had real-time data from a number of sources, both private sector and public sector. And that's really critical for us to be able to not be blind. So in my world, in the housing world, the National Multifamily Housing Council has set up a system where they can do payment tracking. So the first week of the month, this is the first week of May, we want to know, are renters able to make their rent payment? Well, they've got a system where they can track 11.5 million renters. So we can see, they'll be reporting on Friday. How is that first week of May going compared to last year at May? We can see how that's going. McDash Flash has this flash thing that has 30 million mortgages. They can say, how many folks have actually taken us up on the forbearance offer? Right? We already can see there are 3.8 million homeowners have taken us up on forbearance. That's 7% of all mortgages. My office, we've been working with the U.S. Postal Service for decades to get data on addresses that go vacant. That's something we can track to see how are neighborhoods being affected. Are some neighborhoods having some housing go vacant as a result of this? And then the last thing is, which I thought really has been very helpful for this, is these fast turnaround surveys. So last week, a bunch of places went out, used these national panel surveys, and they produced data this week. So we can see how many folks have applied for unemployment, how many have received those unemployment benefits. So we can actually see what's going to happen. So there's a lot of great data out there. Very excited about the new technologies that allow us to get this data fast so we can start moving quickly with our implementation.
So the one thing that I'll emphasize about the Evidence Act again is that it's got the same DNA. I like to say it's got the same DNA as the federal data strategy. The Commission on Evidence-Based Policymaking had a lot of the same people involved. So that a lot of the great ideas which predate my involvement in the strategy have their origin in the same place. Again, if you look at the first year of our action plan, there's a lot of overlap with the Evidence Act. And one of the things that I think is important to which I've heard everybody talk about, but keeping our eye on the ball for the long term. The crisis right now, there's a lot of good work going on with COVID-19, but we still need to continue building the infrastructure at the same time. Timing is never perfect, but a lot of the capacity building that we've started continues. And it's great. I'll say it's also great to hear Todd talk about all the great work that's going on at HUD. I've been really impressed to learn about all of the innovative uses of data that are going on at HUD. And I think there's a lot to learn. And that's one of the great things too, I think, about the federal data strategy and the CDO Council is the sharing of these practices across agencies. So we can talk about the principles and things in the abstract, but when we hear real life examples like Todd has just given us, it really makes us think, hey, I could do that at my agency. Maybe we can have somebody from Todd's team come and talk to us. So I'm really heartened to hear all of this.
Well, I think you all brought a really great perspective to this, both understanding at the theoretical level and the sort of governance level what this means, but also at the very brass tacks level of what does this mean in communities and what does this mean for how the federal government does their work differently. So really thank you all for that great perspective. I think we'll turn to the Q&A now to give our audience a chance to ask some questions. So you can either type your question in the question box or you can raise your hand to ask a question. I think first we'll go with Kathy Stack. Kathy, I see you've got your hand up for a question. Go ahead and feel free to ask that now.
Okay, so I'm curious with COVID, what strategies Congress or the executive branch through the federal data strategy is thinking about to strengthen state and local capacity to use data and analytics. Their state and local governments are clearly on the front lines. They're trying to answer questions that involve sharing data across program silos. Historically, they've been very frustrated with the lack of capacity to do that, but now it's really, I think, apparent about the need. And curious whether Trey or Todd or John have thoughts or anything that they can share about what the federal government is doing or could be doing more of to improve that state and local capacity.
Let's take that first.
I guess I can.
John?
So I'll start. Hey, Kathy, nice to hear your voice. Kathy is one of the real leaders of all things data and evidence, and I've learned a lot from her over time. So I mean, I think there's a few things. Obviously, a lot of this really is happening at the state and local level. I know from the experience of Senator Murray, she got really smart on the challenges from regularly talking with and receiving daily updates and briefings and data from the governor's office and other parts, you know, even the nonprofit sector, which is a very robust one out in Washington State. So I mean, that's one. Secondly is the resources, and part of it, even though it's maybe not exactly on point, is making sure we get the money for state and local through the stabilization fund to make sure that they have the resources so they can continue their capacity, which is something we're very worried about just in general. The states and localities really hemorrhage money right now. And then, you know, you've seen like in the testing plan, which is the testing to make sure there's the diagnostic, the serological, that there's a contact tracing. A lot of that will be, hopefully, that's part of what we put on the onus on the administration, have a little bit of a national strategy, but a lot of that will really be done at the local level, at the state level with the federal government, you know, plugging in as needed, both in some of the overall resources, but also helping with supply issues, supply chain issues, and redirecting testing capacity where needed. If we're going to get out of this, you know, quickly and safely, it's going to require a coordinated effort at all levels. I think Senator Murray, again, with, you know, having Washington State be at the forefront of this, that was really drilled into her. And that's something she has been pushing every step of the way, and using her power of the purse and her ability to, you know, draft laws to really emphasize that at all levels of government.
Thanks, John. Does anyone else want to add to that? Great. I'll remind folks that, oh, go ahead, Todd. Sorry.
I'm a little slow on the mute button. Sorry about that. I think that from HUD's perspective, we collect a lot of data from state and local governments. I think the open data components of various acts, including the Evidence Act, are really important, that we provide that data back to the state and local, so they, in a format, so we have a lot more sort of capacity to take the data, process data, and push it back so state and locals have that information to be able to do their planning, and also to be able to see how they measure up against other state and local governments. So I'm pretty excited about the Data Act, and the Evidence Act, to be able to continue to do that more. We don't do it fast enough. We need to do it faster. And we need to do more technical assistance to our state and local governments on how to use that information to do effective planning. So we have a lot of work to do in that area. It's a good topic. So glad the question was asked.
Yeah, and Todd, I know that one of the questions we ask in our Results from America Federal Standard of Excellence is actually about this: how do you support states and localities? And so I know HUD has done some good work, and you're looking to do some more. But I think that's a really important point to highlight. So thanks for the question and the great answers. I'll remind folks listening today they can either raise their hand or type a question in the chat box to ask a question of the panelists. So I see that Mark Foreman has his hand up for a question. Mark, go ahead. Are you there, Mark? Make sure you're unmuted on your end. Okay. I think we'll have to come back to Mark to see if he is able to.
Can I just say something about the last question?
Yes.
So I just want to let Kathy know that is a priority. You're probably already aware it is explicitly addressed as one of our practices in the federal data strategy. So practice 26 deals with sharing data between state, local, and federal government entities. So it's not reflected in the action plan this year, but it is definitely something that's top of mind and a priority for the federal data strategy.
Great, thanks, Trey. We'll go to our question box here. I think we've got time for one or two more questions. This question is about the oversight work. John, you mentioned sort of Congress's oversight work. This question is about offices of inspector generals and how you all work with them to share data and what sort of, I guess, to broaden a little bit, what is the oversight role here of both congressional branch, the Government Accounting Office, OIGs? How do you think about that when you think about data and COVID response work more generally?
IGs and GAO, which I'll kind of put in that bucket for this, are just so critically important. There are a lot of issues where they're always an alternative way to get information and to have someone at the agency do some really evidence-based hard work and report back to Congress. It's one of several tools that we're always going to have in our toolkit. Some of them are just sending letters to agencies and starting with that with agency heads. Some of those require either immediately or as follow-up to go to IGs to get more information, including the raw data. Some of it we do at the committee level. We have an oversight staff. Our counterpart in the Alexanders have an oversight staff. Sometimes we work together. Sometimes, we work separately, but we share information. We do cross-committee work, even bicameral oversight work. Again, we can use the IGs and GAO to always help complement that. So, I mean, there really is a whole portfolio of oversight that is going on at any one moment that is hugely important. It's important for accountability to know that the administration that Congress is watching. It's important for us to learn. So when we do, C4, the next one, the follow-up to CARES or CARES 2.0, whatever you want to call it, some of that, will be available. Some of it won't. Some of this is going to be 1 year, 2 year, 5 year, 10 years. To really, to get back the data and get the information and really figure out the answers. IGs are hugely important, and I'll just say, I mean, one of the unfortunate things are, in the recent weeks has been some of the chilling effect on some of the IG offices from the administration that I think is really does a disservice to both the agencies, it does to Congress and to the American people. And it's certainly something that Senator Murray is focused on because of the enormous importance of the work that comes out of those offices.
So from a sort of the domestic agency standpoint, we work very closely with the IG and GAO, mostly by providing them with data or information on research that we've done or are doing. And that's always been very helpful. But one thing that I find most useful from my side of the house on what IG and GAO do is they write it down. They write down what is happening. They'll do case studies. They'll present information on specific situations, and they'll write it down. And that's publicly available for time immortal. And sometimes you've got to go back and say, hey, do you remember that program? And maybe we didn't evaluate it, but GAO did look at it. We can go back and look and say, okay, well, what did they do then? So I think IG and GAO have an important oversight role, but also from just a purely write it down so we don't forget it, they do a great job there.
Thanks, Todd. I think we've got time for just one more question before we turn back to Jeff and Jen for some closing remarks to close us out today. Let's just do a quick lightning round. We've got a question here, but I'll do it to all of you in sort of 1 minute. Can you talk about, the Evidence Act, as you all talked about, as Tom put well, I think sort of transformational for the way that government thinks about using evidence and data as tools in a broad way. So what does the next phase of this evidence and data work look like for collecting and gathering both from lessons learned from this pandemic and for more broadly? Why don't we just go around? Tom, maybe we'll start with you, then go to Trey, John, and give Todd the last word.
Okay, I'll be brief and not focus specifically on the pandemic, but more broadly on where I see this trajectory headed. For us, I think this issue about accountability and transparency is something that will be a critical next phase. We are devoting an increasing amount of resources and thinking to trying to figure out how to become even more transparent, open up our processes even more, and increase the efficiency of the feedback loop from our external stakeholders, whether it's think tanks or NGOs or civil society, as well as our stakeholders within government, whether it's key staffers on the Hill or even through the mechanisms like the IG and the GAO.
Okay, Trey, next, Tom.
I'll say that the pandemic itself, while tragic, does offer a great opportunity to test some of the principles of the Federal Data Strategy and the Evidence Act. And because the CDOs and the other councils are meeting and discussing COVID-19 and our response right now, we're learning real time on what to do. And one of the really great things about the Federal Data Strategy is that every year we get to revisit what we should be focused on. So through the annual action plans, we can learn and revise and tweak the Federal Data Strategy so that we can better adapt to crises like these in the future.
John?
I'll piggyback on that first, just to say that we were pleased that the administration did make the decision to sort of hardwire the Evidence Act and marry it up with the Federal Data Strategy. I think it perhaps took a little bit longer to get some of it out, but I think it's for the better good that the two are together, since that's such a flagship part of the management agenda. So we appreciate that. I'll say, look, again, this is a transformational moment with the pandemic. Evidence and data and looking at new ways, asking new questions, collecting data to understand the pivot points, and the pivot points that will ripple far beyond whenever we get something that's close to being normal. The Evidence Act will play a huge role in certainly Congress understanding that and doing legislating going forward, but also for the administration, state and localities throughout the whole sector. So again, we didn't foresee this when we did this, but the timing could not be better for trying to take advantage of these challenges and opportunities.
Thanks, John. Very
Last
word to you.
Oh, am I still on mute here?
Nope, you're
okay.
Good. Go ahead. Sorry.
One of the things that has come out of this is whenever there's a crisis like this, and this is a public health crisis with an economic back end crisis. Those of us who are on the economic side of the house are having to learn about the public health side of the house. And that also translates into learning about the data that they have and the data that we need to understand that they have that can be useful for our work. And it also sort of translates into opportunities for doing data matching and data sharing in a way that we didn't have before. So my expectation is that coming out of this, we will have much stronger connection in my world between housing and health data than we've had in the past.
Great, thanks, Todd. I want to really thank all four of you, Todd, Trey, John, Tom, as well as Sean Carencross for joining us here today. I think this has been a tremendously insightful and interesting, I hope, conversation to our folks listening today. You four know more probably about how this work happens and what it really means on the ground than any 4 people we could assemble. So really thank you for that and the diverse perspective you've brought from the Hill and the legislative branch, international work to specific agency work to working across agencies. So I think it's a great perspective, and the Evidence Act is tremendously important. We certainly at Results for America see the value in the Evidence Act in terms of writing it down, coordinating, and the effects this is having. You know, in our annual federal standard of excellence, we are tracking agencies' progress. We're heartened to see many of them have taken the important first steps to do this work. I look forward to continue to work with them to make this work transparent. Tom, as you talked about, putting it out there so people can understand what it is. And today's conversation is a real great check-in and discussion of this. So thank you to all of our panelists for the great conversation. Thank you to Johns Hopkins and REI Systems for hosting us. Now I want to turn it back over to Jeff for some closing remarks. Jeff?
Hi, thanks very much, Jed. Appreciate your organizing this. I appreciate all of your panelists. Apparently, I did want to give a shout out briefly to Mark Foreman, who apparently was typing a question when we were trying to get him to actually say it out loud. I think his question is very important, and perhaps the panelists, if you want to share any thoughts after the fact, we can distribute them to the attendees. His question was that the Recovery Accountability Transparency Board, after the 2008 crisis, had a single consolidated high quality data hub, primarily for financial data, and he wonders whether or not there's going to be, he thinks it's important for CARES loan data, grants data, and perhaps some of the program data that might be coming out over the next months and years, and wonders whether or not there's any similar sort of effort that's either planned or underway. So again, if the panelists have any sorts of thoughts about that they can share or information about it, we'd be happy to pass it along. But I want to, with all of you as attendees, to say these events, both Johns Hopkins and REI Systems host every other month. We would, and we take a hiatus during the summer typically, partly because school is out and partly because there's less attention, but we would love to hear your suggestions for topics, whether they be a specific speaker, whether they be a specific agency, whether they be a specific type of analysis or a particular type of challenge about which you want to learn. We will be happy to help arrange to have speakers on those topics and discussions around them. And they may be things like an analytic method, such as artificial intelligence or a particular result achieved. One of our previous, I think it was last November, we had the Deputy Administrator of the Transportation Security Administration speak about what a senior executive looks for in analytics. So a wide range of topics are possible. Let me emphasize also, our panelists have kindly agreed that since you can't find and meet them in person today, if you'd like to reach out to them, send an email to either Ashley Keaton or to myself, jmyers@reisystems.com, and we can put you in touch with the panelists. If you want to, as some folks occasionally do, connect with the government analytics degree and certificate programs at Johns Hopkins, I'll be so bold as to share Jennifer Bachner's contact information. She can help you with that. It is jbachner, B-A-C-H-N-E-R, @jhu.edu. And for REI Systems, I'm Jeff Myers. Stay safe and stay in good health. And Jen, let me turn it over to you.
Thanks, Jeff. And yes, please don't hesitate to reach out. Again, my email address is jbachner@jhu.edu. I want to thank the audience for attending. I want to give a special thank you to Jed Herman, one of our amazing government analytics students and a policy leader as well, for organizing this panel. Thank you to the panelists. And I also hope everyone stays safe and well and stays in touch.